What in God's name is a woman like you doing at a table like this? Don't you know these games aren't for your kind?" The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through the opulent air of the Elysian Spire Casino, a playground for the world's most powerful. They were meant to sting, to humiliate, to put her in her place. But before the echo of the insult could even fade, the real assault began. A raw, physical violation that would ignite a firestorm. Tiffany Sterling, the casino magnate's platinum blonde daughter, draped in a crimson dress that shimmered like fresh blood, moved with the predatory grace of a viper. One hand clutched a crystal glass of champagne, the other shot out, her manicured fingers twisting brutally into the elegant chignon of the black CEO, Isabella Sterling. She yanked, a vicious, tearing motion. Isabella's head snapped to the side, the force of the pull ripping strands of hair from her scalp. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that was quickly drowned out by a wave of cruel laughter. Chips scattered across the green baize like fallen leaves. A glass of aged whiskey toppled, the amber liquid bleeding into the felt. Two men in bespoke tuxedos flanking Tiffany roared with laughter, slapping each other on the back as if they were witnessing the punchline of a brilliant joke. All around them, a sea of glowing rectangles emerged as the elite guests raised their phones, eager to capture every second of the brutal spectacle. This wasn't an outrage. It was premium entertainment. Isabella's palms flattened against the table, her knuckles white as she fought to steady herself. Her gown, a magnificent creation of burnt orange silk, seemed to mock the ugliness of the moment. The violent jerk had stolen her breath, her eyes widening not just with pain but with a profound, soul-shaking disbelief. For a fleeting second, she wasn't the titan of industry who commanded boardrooms and reshaped skylines. She was prey, cornered and exposed in a glittering pit of vipers. Tiffany leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper that carried across the hushed room. "See?" she sneered, giving Isabella's hair another vicious tug. "Even her hair doesn't know its place." The room erupted in another chorus of laughter, the sound bouncing off the gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers. But beneath the searing pain and the crushing weight of humiliation, something ancient and unyielding stirred within Isabella. A quiet strength, forged in the fires of 1,000 slights, a resilience that had been her shield and her sword. Her breath steadied, her gaze sharpened, her spirit refusing to be broken. The chandeliers above cast a cold, blue-white light on the scene, illuminating the droplets of champagne dripping from Tiffany's glass. The laughter roared, a tidal wave of mockery. But the atmosphere had begun to shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. The crowd didn't sense it yet. Tiffany, drunk on her own cruelty, was oblivious. But the game had just begun, and the tables were about to turn in a way no one could have ever imagined. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're joining us from. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and justice is worth fighting for, then smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these stories to light, stories that have the power to spark real change. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's get back to Isabella. The air in the casino grew thick, heavy with unspoken cruelty. The roulette wheel spun to a silent stop, the little silver ball settling into its final resting place. But no one noticed. Every eye was fixed on Isabella. The woman in the orange gown, a faint red mark blooming on her cheek where Tiffany's fingers had dug in, a cruel brand of shame under the brilliant lights. A heavy silence descended, thick with anticipation. Would she scream? Would she fight back? She did neither. Her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She lifted her chin, just a fraction, a subtle act of defiance that told the world she would not be diminished. But in her stillness, she became a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of the crowd back at them, their sneers, their laughter, their insatiable hunger for a spectacle. A man in a pristine white tuxedo leaned towards his date, his voice a stage whisper. "She should be grateful for the attention," he murmured. His companion giggled, her diamond necklace trembling with her amusement. Across the room, 2 waiters stood frozen, their silver trays held aloft. One looked on with a flicker of unease, his eyes darting between Tiffany and Isabella. The other gave a subtle shake of his head, a silent warning. "Don't get involved." Their silence was a form of consent, a quiet endorsement of the cruelty unfolding before them. The casino's hum seemed to grow louder, more menacing. Phones were angled higher, their lenses like 100 unblinking eyes, ready to capture and immortalize her humiliation. Someone whispered, "This is going to be epic." Isabella's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the cavern of her chest. But with a conscious effort, she slowed her breathing, drawing on a lifetime of practice in maintaining composure under fire. "Do not give them what they want," she told herself. "Do not let their laughter become your story." Her hand rose, not to strike back, not to soothe the stinging on her cheek, but to gracefully tuck a stray strand of hair back into her immaculate chignon. It was an act of such controlled grace that it mocked the chaos swirling around her. She would not let them see her break. Tiffany tilted her head, a predator sensing the crowd's bloodlust. She let out a peal of laughter, her red dress catching the light like a flickering flame. "See?" she announced to the room. "Her silence is a confession. She knows her place." The laughter rippled outwards, a wave of derision washing over Isabella. A burly security guard in a black suit glanced at Tiffany, then at Isabella. His eyes narrowed, not with concern for the victim, but with suspicion for the one who had dared to disrupt the gilded peace of the casino. His hand rested on his earpiece, a silent sentinel waiting for a command from the wrong person. Isabella met his gaze, letting it slide over her like smoke. She had learned long ago that when power feigns blindness, it is always a choice. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. The sting on her cheek deepened into a burning heat, but her gaze remained unwavering. The casino, with its marble floors and gold-leafed ceilings, was designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit under the weight of its opulence. But she had walked through far darker corridors and emerged not just unscathed, but victorious. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a grotesque gallery of amusement and disdain. Tiffany smirked, her lips a slash of crimson. She was so sure of her victory. But she had forgotten one crucial thing about storms. They don't always announce their arrival with thunder. Sometimes they gather in the silence, and in the heart of that silence, Isabella's resolve was hardening into something unbreakable. The silence was a fleeting thing, a brief interlude in a place built on the symphony of greed and chance. Tiffany, basking in the glow of her perceived triumph, let her laughter cascade through the room, as effervescent and intoxicating as the champagne she held. She began to circle Isabella, her heels clicking a sharp, arrogant rhythm on the marble floor. Each step was a declaration of ownership, a reminder that this was her kingdom, and Isabella was merely a trespasser. The crimson of her dress was a defiant slash of color against the cool, blue-white light of the casino. She paused, tilting her head as she scrutinized Isabella's face, her expression a mixture of contempt and amusement. Then, her voice, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the air. "Look at her!" she proclaimed. "Even her cheek blush is a shade darker than the felt on this table." The words were a fresh assault, and the crowd responded with a fresh wave of laughter, a guttural, baying sound that filled the cavernous room. Men in expensive suits leaned forward, their faces alight with predatory glee. Women adorned with diamonds and pearls hid their smiles behind manicured hands, their eyes sparkling with cruel amusement. A blackjack dealer, his face a mask of professional indifference, bit his lip to keep from laughing, but his eyes betrayed him. He was enjoying the show. The phones were still out, their lenses capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama. Tiffany knew she had an audience, and she played to it with the skill of a seasoned performer. She turned towards one of the cameras, a smirk playing on her lips, and then turned back to Isabella, dragging her into the frame of her cruel performance. "Smile for the cameras, darling," she hissed, tapping Isabella's cheek with 2 fingers, the same cheek she had pinched just moments before. "Don't you want the world to see how magnanimous we are, allowing you to grace our presence?" The crowd roared its approval. Someone at the bar shouted, "Get a picture of her next to the high rollers table. It'll be a collector's item." More laughter followed, a cacophony of derision that bounced off the crystalline brass fixtures. Isabella remained motionless, her spine a rod of steel. Her face was a canvas of controlled emotion, her eyes refusing to yield to the humiliation. The silence was her armor, though every word was a fresh wound. Tiffany leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "People like you," she said, her words dripping with venom, "don't sit at my father's tables. People like you serve the drinks or scrub the floors." Gasps of feigned shock and genuine amusement rippled through the room. A young man in a tailored suit raised his glass. "Hear, hear," he shouted. Champagne sloshed over the rim of his glass as others joined the toast, raising their flutes not in celebration, but in a collective act of mockery. The casino had transformed into a theater of cruelty, with Tiffany as the star and Isabella cast in the role of the fool. Or so they thought. Isabella's hand, hidden by the folds of her gown, curled into a tight fist. Her nails dug into her palm, the sharp, crescent-shaped indentations a small, secret pain that grounded her in the swirling chaos. But her face, her posture, remained a study in perfect restraint. "Not yet," she told herself. "They believe this is power. They believe this is control. Let them revel in their ignorance. Their empire is built on a foundation of arrogance, and arrogance is a blindness far more profound than any darkness." Across the room, an older gentleman in a white dinner jacket watched the scene unfold, with a look of deep unease. His lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line, but he said nothing. His silence, too, was a form of complicity, another voice in the chorus of cruelty. Tiffany, sensing her power, spun around to face the crowd. "Tell me," she said, her voice ringing out like a dealer calling a jackpot. "Doesn't she look utterly out of place here, doesn't she?" The crowd responded with a resounding, "Yes, yes." Their voices beat against Isabella like waves against a cliff face. And yet, the cliff doesn't break. It stands, resolute, waiting for the tide to turn. Isabella's eyes narrowed, but she wasn't looking at Tiffany. She was looking past her, at the glowing poker tables, at the dealers shifting uncomfortably, at the managers observing from the mezzanine above. She was looking at the empire that thought it could silence her. They had no idea what her silence was capable of. The casino floor pulsed with the rhythm of mockery, a grotesque heartbeat of cruelty. The soft, elegant notes of the grand piano were lost in the cacophony of laughter and whispers. Tiffany's voice had become the anthem of the room, and the crowd, a willing choir, followed her lead. Guests who might have initially looked away now leaned in, their faces illuminated by the ghoulish glow of their phone screens, their morbid curiosity overriding any sense of decency. They were feeding on the cruelty, drawn to it like moths to a flame. Every second of Isabella's stillness was being documented, shared, and consumed by a voracious, unseen audience. She could feel their eyes on her, sharp and piercing as daggers. In their gaze, she was no longer a guest, a player in the high-stakes game of life and commerce. She was an object of derision, a spectacle to be gawked at. A couple at the roulette table, their faces a mask of smug superiority, deliberately turned their backs on her. A clear, unmistakable signal that she did not belong. A dealer, his hands trembling slightly, nervously adjusted his bow tie, and then began to rearrange the chips in his tray, as if trying to create a physical distance between himself and the unfolding drama. Even the waitstaff, who were usually a blur of silent, efficient movement, had retreated to the shadows, their trays clutched to their chests like shields, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Then came the whisper, a venomous little dart of a sound that found its mark with deadly accuracy. A man in a tailored white tuxedo, his face flushed with champagne and schadenfreude, leaned towards his companion. "She shouldn't even be here," he said, his voice just loud enough for Isabella to hear. The words, though not new to her, struck with a fresh, raw pain. They were a bitter echo of a lifetime of slights, of closed doors and condescending smiles. She had heard them in boardrooms, in exclusive country clubs, in the hushed conspiratorial tones of those who believed their privilege was a birthright. And now, here they were again, brazen and unapologetic, amplified by the glittering, heartless luxury of the casino. Tiffany, who had overheard the man's remark, clapped her hands together in delight, as if he had just delivered the punchline to a clever joke. Her friends, a coterie of sycophants and hangers-on, joined in the laughter, their amusement a fresh wave of cruelty washing over Isabella. Isabella's pulse hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. Her gaze swept the room, not searching for an ally. She knew there were none to be found, but for a flicker of humanity in their eyes. She found none. Not a single face registered anything other than amusement, contempt, or a cold, detached curiosity. Not one hand was raised to stop the spectacle. The security guard's stare deepened, the suspicion in his eyes hardening into a cold certainty. He didn't see a victim. He saw a problem, a disruption to the smooth, profitable hum of the casino. His hand brushed against his earpiece, his thumb hovering over the button, ready to escort the problem away. And the problem, in his eyes, was not the woman in the red dress, but the woman in the orange gown. The weight of their collective disdain pressed down on her, a crushing, suffocating force. But she stood her ground, her feet rooted to the marble floor, her orange gown glowed in the neon and crystal, a lone, defiant flame in a room that was trying its best to extinguish her. She slowed her breathing, a deliberate, conscious act of control. Inhale. Exhale. Every second of her restraint was an act of resistance. Every refusal to bow was an act of defiance. Still the laughter stabbed at her, the whispers 1,000 tiny cuts on her soul. The isolation was a cold, heavy cloak wrapped around her shoulders. Tiffany, sensing her victory, leaned in once more, her red dress a blur of crimson against Isabella's vision. Her whisper, though soft, was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You see," she said, her voice laced with triumph. "Not one person here is on your side. That's because they all know the truth. You'll always be an outsider. Always." The crowd chuckled, their complicity a final damning verdict. But Isabella's gaze lifted not to Tiffany, not to the sea of hostile faces, but upwards, past the glittering chandeliers, to the mirrored ceiling. And in that reflection she saw herself, not as they saw her, but as she truly was, tall, poised, unbroken. Her reflection stared back at her with a quiet, unshakable dignity that they could not touch. Alone, she reminded herself, does not mean powerless. Their laughter is loud because their fear is louder, and tonight they will learn why. The casino hummed on, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. Her chest tightened, the sting on her cheek a pulsing, angry brand. The laughter swelled and echoed around her, a relentless, suffocating tide. But inside, a vast, deep silence was growing, a silence that was heavier, more powerful than all their noise. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the cacophony of the casino, the clatter of chips, the shuffle of cards, the fizz of champagne, fade into a distant hum. The casino was a theater, and she had seen this play before. The actors were different, the set more opulent, but the script was always the same. You don't belong. You're less than. You're a joke. Her memory, a cruel and faithful servant, replayed a montage of past humiliations. The conference room, years ago, where a senior executive had chuckled and said, "Pretty smile, but leave the important decisions to the men." The bank lobby, where a loan officer had glanced at her skin before saying, "We don't typically handle accounts of this size for people like you." The boardroom, where a sudden, icy silence had fallen the moment she entered, as if her very presence had cracked the polished mahogany table. Each time she had swallowed the sting, not out of weakness, but out of a deep, strategic understanding of power. Power doesn't scream and shout. It waits, it endures, it listens until the perfect moment of silence can crush the loudest laughter. Her lips parted, not to speak, but to draw a slow, deliberate breath, fueling the fire within. Her gaze locked forward, unwavering. Dignity is not something you beg for. It's not something you defend. It is something you embody even when you are being mocked, even when you are being bruised. The crowd wanted a reaction. They craved a scene, a display of anger, a flood of tears, a raised voice. They wanted her to validate their narrative, to confirm their belief that she was fragile, unworthy, out of place. But she would not give them the satisfaction. Instead, she let her silence become her posture, her shoulders squared, her chin held high, her hands steady at her sides. Her very presence was a declaration. "I will not be bowed by your arrogance." Tiffany noticed the shift. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her eyes, a tiny crack in her smug facade. She tightened her grip on her audience, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Look at her," she sneered. "She thinks her silence makes her strong, but it only makes her look small and pathetic." The crowd cheered, a Pavlovian response to her command, but the silence had a way of seeping into the cracks of their arrogance. Isabella's heartbeat slowed, the sting on her cheek beginning to dull. She thought of her journey, not just to this casino, but to every seat of power that had once been denied to her. She remembered kicking down the doors, not with force, but with sheer, undeniable excellence. She remembered earning her place, not their permission. Her eyes shifted, not to Tiffany, but to the glittering tables beyond. The roulette wheels, the poker chips, the nervous dealers. This entire empire, this gilded palace of greed and chance, was built on a foundation of money. And money, she knew, was a language she spoke more fluently than anyone in the room. "They think I'm trapped on their stage," she thought, "but the truth is they've just stepped onto mine." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not a smile of amusement, but a smile of promise. The crowd didn't see it yet. Tiffany didn't understand it yet, but the tide was already turning. Tiffany thrived on the adoration of the crowd. Their laughter was her symphony, and she was its masterful conductor, The casino was her stage, and she was determined to stretch out the humiliation until it became a suffocating, unbearable thing. She leaned back against a baccarat table, her red dress a vibrant, arrogant flame against the cool, neon-lit backdrop. She swirled the champagne in her glass, the bubbles rising and popping in a rhythm that was both lazy and cruel. Then, with a smirk that was all sharp angles and condescension, she raised her voice, ensuring that everyone could hear. "Do you see how quiet she is?" she asked the room. "It's almost endearing, like a child who has wandered into the deep end of the pool and suddenly realizes she can't swim." The crowd chuckled, their amusement a low, rumbling sound that filled the room. A man at a nearby blackjack table added, "Maybe she's just waiting for someone to tell her what to do." More laughter followed, a cruel, echoing sound that bounced off the marble and glass. Tiffany pushed herself off the table and glided closer to Isabella, her heels clicking like the countdown of a timer on the polished floor. She stopped just inches away, her perfume, a cloying blend of roses and smoke, enveloping Isabella in a suffocating cloud. "You know what's truly hilarious?" she whispered, though her voice carried to every corner of the room. "You waltz in here, draped in orange silk and dripping with diamonds, pretending that you're one of us. But no matter how much money you accumulate, you'll always look like you snuck in through the service entrance." The crowd gasped, then erupted into a fresh wave of cheers and applause, their approval a testament to their own moral bankruptcy. Someone clapped loudly, as if rewarding a particularly brilliant performance. Isabella stood still, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, her silence a burning, incandescent thing. But inside, her stomach twisted into a tight knot, every word a fresh cut on the canvas of her history. Tiffany wasn't finished. She reached out again, her hand hovering near Isabella's cheek, a clear threat to repeat the earlier insult. But this time, she stopped just short of making contact, pinching the air in a gesture of mocking restraint. "See this?" she said to the crowd. "It's like trying to squeeze a doll. She doesn't even flinch, because deep down, she knows she's powerless." The room roared with laughter, their cruelty emboldened by Tiffany's lead. A man in a tuxedo slapped the table in delight. A woman raised her phone higher, angling for the perfect shot of the unfolding drama. But Isabella's eyes didn't flinch. They remained locked on Tiffany, unwavering, a quiet, unquenchable flame. Her silence began to unnerve Tiffany. The smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly masked it with another sneer, tossing her hair back in a gesture of defiance. "Don't you dare look at me like that," she hissed. "This is my father's house. These are our tables. And you? You're just a guest who has long overstayed her welcome?" The crowd clapped again, eager to reaffirm her dominance. Even the dealers, their faces a mask of professional neutrality, forced polite smiles, unwilling to disrupt the carefully scripted drama. But beneath the glittering surface, something was beginning to shift. Isabella's hands remained at her sides, steady and still, her posture a testament to her unshakable resolve. Yet her eyes carried a weight that Tiffany could not name, a storm gathering without a single clap of thunder. Let her gloat, Isabella thought. Let her believe she owns this room, this moment. The higher she climbs on her ladder of arrogance, the more devastating the fall will be. Tiffany lifted her glass in a mock toast. "To her," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, a living, breathing reminder that money can buy a designer dress, but it can never buy class. The room roared with laughter, the sound shaking the chandeliers. And still, the woman in orange stood tall, silent, burning, waiting. The laughter, once a roaring, confident sound, began to fade, lingering in the air like a plume of acrid smoke. As it dissipated, something unexpected began to happen. Isabella hadn't moved, she hadn't spoken, she hadn't so much as raised an eyebrow, but her stillness, her unwavering, unyielding silence was beginning to alter the very atmosphere of the room. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of defiance, a quiet, powerful resistance that was more potent than any shout. Her silence spread like a shadow, creeping into the corners of the room, touching every person, every object. It made some of the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter dying in their throats. The dealers exchanged uneasy glances, the flicker of fear in their eyes betraying their carefully constructed masks of professionalism. Even the pianist, sensing the shift in the room's energy, let the final, lingering note of his melody fade into the silence, not daring to begin another. Tiffany noticed, and she didn't like it. She had expected a reaction, a breakdown, a torrent of angry words, anything that would have validated her dominance. But instead, the woman in orange stood even taller, her chin angled just so, the light from the chandeliers creating a halo around her head. The flush on her cheek had subsided, replaced by a steely, unreadable expression. And her eyes, dark and unwavering, were no longer looking at Tiffany, but through her, as if she were nothing more than a minor annoyance, a piece of dust to be brushed away. It unsettled her, so she doubled down, her voice sharp and desperate, a last-ditch attempt to regain control. "Oh, don't you dare give me that look," she sneered, her voice a shrill, unpleasant sound. She spun around to face the crowd. "Do you see this? She thinks her silence makes her look noble, but it just makes her look small and insignificant." Her audience laughed again, but the sound was different now, less spontaneous, more forced. They were laughing because they felt they were supposed to. Isabella's lips parted slightly, not to speak, but to release a slow, deliberate breath. It was the smallest of gestures, but it was a clear signal that she was in complete control, that her restraint was a choice, not a necessity. And in that moment, her restraint was a terrifying thing. Tiffany's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her perfume once again a suffocating presence. Her voice dropped to a hiss, meant for both Isabella and the crowd. "I know what you're trying to do," she said, "but you don't scare me. You'll never scare me." Yet, even as she spoke the words, her hand trembled, a subtle but undeniable tremor that made the champagne in her glass slosh against the crystal. She quickly tried to cover it with another toss of her hair, but it was too late. Isabella had seen it. "She feels it," Isabella thought. "She feels the ground shifting beneath her feet." The crowd sensed it too, though they couldn't have articulated it. Their laughter was softer now, scattered and uncertain. Some of the guests had even lowered their phones, the spectacle having lost its morbid appeal. Isabella inhaled deeply, the silk of her orange gown shimmering with the movement. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone was enough to press against the arrogance in the room, to slowly, invisibly, bend it to her will. For the first time that night, Tiffany's smirk faltered, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker. But in a room built on appearances, even a flicker was a fracture. She tried to cover it with one final desperate barb, her voice louder than before. "You can stand there all night, but you'll never be one of us." The words rang out, sharp and desperate, but the echo died quickly, swallowed by the growing, powerful silence of the woman in orange. The casino no longer pulsed with easy laughter. The sound that once bounced from crystal chandeliers and mirrored ceilings now thinned, uncertain, like an orchestra, suddenly off-key. Isabella had not spoken a word, but her silence had become a force of its own. It filled the space between every laugh, pressed against every smirk, and stretched itself across the room like a quiet storm gathering above glittering tables. Guests who had leaned forward eagerly before now shifted back. Phones lowered slightly, some screens dimmed. Their recordings had lost their thrill. The spectacle no longer looked like victory. It looked like bullying. And somewhere deep inside, they knew it. Tiffany sensed the shift and bristled. She needed control. She needed their eyes locked on her performance. So she raised her glass higher, her voice slicing through the hum. "Don't be fooled. She's nothing. She's nobody. A costume doesn't make her belong here." But the words hung strangely in the air, forced, defensive. The crowd's response was tepid. A few polite chuckles, a few murmurs, nothing like the roar from before. A man at the roulette table whispered to his companion, "She hasn't said a word, but look at her. She's not breaking." Another guest, a woman draped in emerald silk, studied Isabella carefully, her brows furrowed. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't laughing. She was wondering. Isabella stood poised, every detail of her appearance sharpened by the tension, the orange gown flowing like fire under neon blue, the bun pulled tight at the crown of her head, the diamonds catching fractured light. Her presence was no longer that of a guest cornered. It was of a queen disguised among thieves. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, an emotion so subtle, yet in the silence it carried the weight of thunder. The crowd shifted again, uneasy, curious, waiting. Tiffany caught it too. Fear crawled beneath her skin, though she buried it under another laugh. She stepped closer, nearly nose to nose with the woman she tried to humiliate. "Don't you dare look at me like that," she hissed, her words cracked by something unsteady. "You think your silence makes you powerful? You're wrong. You'll always be beneath us." Her hand shot forward again, fingers grazing Isabella's cheek. But she hesitated, pulling back at the last second. For the first time that night, she didn't follow through. The crowd saw it, and the hesitation screamed louder than any insult. Whispers rippled. "Did you see that?" She stopped. "Why?" Isabella's eyes did not blink. Her silence pierced deeper than words, and Tiffany, desperate, trembling beneath the weight she could not name, tightened her grip on her glass instead. She lifted it high, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. But the crowd wasn't laughing with her anymore. They were watching her, watching how the cracks spread, and watching the woman in orange, who stood taller with every passing second. The tide was turning. The silence stretched until it became a tangible thing. A heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual sounds of the casino. The floor, once alive with the symphony of greed and chance, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, an energy that was tense, uneasy, and expectant. Isabella stood in the center of it all, her orange gown a beacon of defiance, her posture so commanding that it was as if she had personally laid the marble tiles beneath her feet. She had not lifted a hand, she had not spoken a word, yet the entire room seemed to bend towards her, drawn in by the sheer force of her will. The weight of her dignity was proving to be far heavier than the weight of their arrogance. Eyes that had once mocked her now lingered with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Whispers passed from person to person like cards being dealt across the green felt tables. "Who is she?" someone murmured near the bar. "I don't know," another replied, "but she's not someone you mess with." Tiffany, sensing the shift, panicked. Her confidence, once so unshakable, had completely evaporated, and for the first time, her smirk looked like a cheap, ill-fitting mask. She needed to reclaim the stage, to wrest back control of the narrative. Desperation sharpened her voice. "Don't just stand there," she shouted, her laughter a shrill, grating sound that was devoid of any real mirth. "Say something. Prove that you're more than just a pretty dress and a borrowed seat at my father's tables." But her words rang hollow. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread, waiting not for Tiffany's next move, but for the response of the woman she had tried to break. Isabella's gaze swept the room, her silence pressing deeper, demanding their full and undivided attention. Her eyes lingered on the dealers, on the managers watching from the mezzanine, on the men and women who were now clutching their chips a little tighter. This empire, she knew, thrived on fear, on silence, on spectacle. But tonight, the silence was hers to command. And then she moved, just one step forward. The sound of her heel against the marble floor cracked through the room like a gavel striking a block. Heads turned, breaths were held. Tiffany, acting on pure instinct, took a step back. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but the crowd saw it. And in that one tiny moment, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Isabella didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply let her eyes rest on Tiffany, her gaze steady, unblinking, and Tiffany trembled. Now they see, Isabella thought. Now they see who truly commands this room. The casino felt different. The chandeliers still glowed, the chips still clattered in the distance, but the energy was no longer Tiffany's to control. It was owned by the silence, by the woman who had refused to bend. Guests who had once sneered now glanced nervously at one another, the bitter taste of their earlier laughter still lingering in their mouths. Some shifted uncomfortably, a flush of shame creeping up their necks as they were forced to confront their own complicity. Tiffany, cornered by an audience that was no longer on her side, tightened her grip on her champagne glass until her knuckles turned white. She forced another laugh, a brittle, sharp sound that shattered against the wall of silence. No one joined her. Isabella let the moment stretch, savoring the slow, delicious turning of the tables. She didn't need words to reclaim her dignity. Her silence had already done that. And yet, deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. Silence was her weapon, but truth and power were the victories she had yet to claim. The storm was gathering, and the air in the casino was thick with the promise of rain. The air inside the casino had grown thick and heavy, the weight of the silence pressing down with more force than the clinking of glasses or the shuffling of cards. Isabella didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness had already dismantled Tiffany's control, piece by painstaking piece. But now, it was time to make her move. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the clutch bag that rested against her side. The crowd watched her every move, their curiosity a tightly coiled spring. Was this it? Was this the breaking point? Would she lash out? Would she crumble? No. She pulled out a phone, a sleek black device that gleamed under the neon lights. She held it loosely in one hand, her thumb hovering over the screen, as if a single press of a button could reshape the very fabric of the night. Tiffany scoffed, her voice too sharp, too quick. "What are you going to do? Call for help? Call your driver to come pick you up at the back entrance? Go ahead, call anyone you want. This is my father's world, not yours." But her laughter died in her throat when no one else joined in. Isabella lifted her gaze from the phone, her eyes locking with Tiffany's. Then, she pressed a button and lifted the phone to her ear. The room went still. The roulette wheel spun in idle silence, its silver ball clicking in a meaningless, hypnotic rhythm. A dealer froze mid-shuffle, every head in the room turned, every ear strained to catch a fragment of her words. Her voice, when it came, was low but unyielding, calm, precise, the kind of voice that carried an immense weight without needing to be raised. "Yes," she said. "It's time. Pull the 4 billion. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the silence. 4 billion. The number crackled through the crystal air like a bolt of lightning. A few guests laughed nervously, thinking it was a bluff, a desperate act of bravado. But others, those who moved in the same rarefied circles as Isabella, recognized the tone. This was not a bluff. She ended the call without any ceremony, slipping the phone back into her clutch as if she had just ordered a glass of water. Tiffany blinked rapidly, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "Nobody moves that kind of money with a single phone call." But the crowd wasn't so sure. A man in a tailored suit leaned forward, whispering to his companion. "She can. I've heard the stories. If she's who I think she is, she absolutely can." The whispers spread like wildfire, a wave of speculation and awe washing over the room. "4 billion? Who is she? Did she say immediately?" Isabella let the murmurs ripple around her, unchecked. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was now gilded with an undeniable authority. Every second that passed, the tension in the room grew tighter, more palpable. Tiffany, desperate to regain her footing, slammed her empty glass down on the table. "You're nothing but a fraud in a fancy dress," she shrieked. "My father owns this place. You—" But her words cracked, her voice straining against the weight of the silence, against the whispers she could no longer control. Isabella tilted her head, her gaze steady, her presence unshakable. Then she took a single step closer, and Tiffany, without even realizing it, took a step back. The crowd noticed, and in that one, small movement, the empire of mockery began to crumble. The murmurs grew louder, no longer whispers, but restless waves of sound rolling across the casino floor. Dealers hesitated, their hands hovering over the cards, their eyes darting nervously towards the pit bosses. Guests clutched their chips a little tighter, their gazes shifting between the crimson-clad Tiffany and the woman in orange who had just moved billions with a single devastating sentence. The chandeliers above seemed to hold their breath, their glittering light casting long, dancing shadows on the floor. Isabella stood unflinching, the phone safely back in her clutch, her hands still. For her, the call was a done deal, a decision already set in motion. But for the crowd, it was the beginning of something they couldn't yet comprehend, and that made it all the more terrifying. Tiffany tried to rally, her voice shrill with desperation. "She's bluffing. Don't listen to her. No one has that kind of power, least of all her." But her words landed with a thud. The crowd wasn't looking at her anymore. They were all looking at Isabella. And then it happened. A pit boss in a charcoal suit, his face a mask of concern, received a call on his headset. His brows furrowed, his posture stiffening. He whispered something to a nearby dealer, who in turn whispered to another. Like a line of dominoes, the ripple of alarm spread across the casino floor. Moments later, a manager from the executive suite descended the grand staircase, his face pale, his phone glued to his ear. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes urgently scanning the tables. His voice was low but frantic. "We've got a massive liquidity drop. 4 billion just wired out." The words spread like wildfire. 4 billion, the guests repeated, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. Not a joke, not a bluff. It was real. Tiffany's painted-on confidence finally shattered. Her hand, which was reaching for another glass of champagne, began to shake uncontrollably. "No," she muttered, her voice a weak, trembling thing. "No, that's impossible. Daddy controls everything here." But the truth, cold and undeniable, was unraveling right in front of her. The empire wasn't as untouchable as she had always believed, and the woman she had so cruelly mocked had just proven it. Isabella remained still, her silence a throne she didn't need to claim. Her eyes swept the room, calm, deliberate, letting the weight of the moment crush the laughter that had once tried to drown her. A guest near the bar muttered, "She just pulled the rug out from under this entire place." Another added, "If she can move that kind of money with a single phone call, she doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." The crowd's energy had shifted completely. They were no longer complicit in Tiffany's cruelty, no longer amused by her childish antics. They were witnessing real power, the kind of power that didn't need to shout or posture or beg for attention. It simply was. Tiffany stumbled for words, her voice a weak echo of its former self. She's lying. This is still my father's casino. We own this place. But no one was listening anymore. Isabella's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. Not a smug smile, not a mocking smile, but a smile of promise. It was the kind of smile that carried with it centuries of survival, decades of resilience, and tonight, a hard-won victory. And though she still had not spoken a single word directly to her tormentor, her presence screamed a message that was louder than any insult could ever be. "You tried to make me small, but I am the storm that will break your empire." The casino's hum had dimmed into a low, ominous dread. The fall had begun. The casino's glittering facade, once a symbol of unshakable power and excess, began to fracture before their very eyes. What had been a temple of chance, with its flashing lights, rolling dice, and swinging fortunes, now trembled under the weight of a truth it could no longer hide. The foundation had cracked. Phones buzzed in pockets all around the room, their screens lighting up with breaking alerts from financial news desks. Whispers sharpened into urgent, fearful words. "4 billion pulled out. Liquidity gone. This casino is bleeding." Pit bosses rushed into corners, their voices low and frantic as they spoke into their headsets. Dealers froze mid-hand, their nervous, professional smiles melting away as the pit floor ground to a halt. The roulette ball clattered to a stop, forgotten in its wheel. And in the center of it all, Isabella stood unmoving in her gown of orange flame, her silence towering over the chaos she had unleashed. Tiffany spun in place, her face a mask of pure panic. "Stop staring at her! This is still my father's casino!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. She pointed a trembling finger at Isabella, her red dress shaking as much as her hands. "She's bluffing. She can't touch us." But even as she said the words, another manager descended the staircase, his voice a desperate shout into his headset. "We've lost our major backers. The tables are frozen." Gasps spread through the room like sparks from a fire. Guests began to pull away from Tiffany, their faces a mixture of fear and contempt. They were no longer entertained, no longer complicit. Her empire of laughter had crumbled around her, leaving her exposed and alone in the deafening silence. And in that silence stood the woman she had tried to break. Isabella finally moved. One slow, deliberate step forward, then another. The click of her heel on the marble floor echoed through the room like a judge's verdict. Tiffany stumbled back, her once commanding smirk gone, her power drained away like sand through her fingers. She had thrown words like daggers, hurled mockery like stones. And yet, here she stood, small, powerless, cornered by the very silence she had tried to ridicule. Isabella stopped just short of her, their eyes locking, one trembling with fear, the other unyielding with a quiet, unshakable strength. And then, for the first time since the ordeal began, Isabella spoke. Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devastating. "You treated me like a joke," she said, her words hanging in the air like a clap of thunder. "But tonight, I wrote the punchline." No one laughed. No one dared. Isabella turned, her gown catching the light from the chandeliers like embers trailing in her wake. She walked through the parted crowd, every step a final, definitive statement. Guests moved aside instinctively, their heads bowed, their eyes no longer filled with mockery, but with a newfound, grudging respect. They knew now that she wasn't just wealthy, she wasn't just powerful, she was dignity made flesh, unyielding, undeniable. At the door, she paused, the silence following her like a loyal subject. Then she was gone, leaving the casino to tremble in her absence, and Tiffany to stand alone in the ruins of her father's empire. Outside, the cool night air was a welcome balm against her skin. The city stretched out before her, its towers glittering like a sea of stars bowing in acknowledgement. She lifted her chin, took a deep, cleansing breath, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not a smile of revenge, not a smile of victory, but a smile of quiet satisfaction for a truth that needed no applause. She had endured. She had prevailed. And she had reminded the world that justice doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it simply stands its ground, silent and unshakable, until the world has no choice but to listen.